All right, just a few comments on our Torah portions first, and then I'm going to go into the Psalms. That's what's coming around. The first thing I want to note, and then I'll take some questions from you guys. First thing is, by the way, I want to thank Linda for volunteering to read for us today. It's always nice to have people volunteer. Just run up here and so willing. First thing is that they are called Moedim, appointed times, and they are called God's appointed times, that they belong to Him. I think that's theologically important because sometimes in this movement we get overly enamored with Jews or Israel as if somehow, for instance, the land belongs to God first. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. The Moedim belong to Him. Everything belongs to Him. Now, He does give some things to Israel, yes, but ultimately it still reverts and connects back to Him. So that we should not be enamored with them, but we should be enamored with Him. And oftentimes there's this shift in focus to seeing them as important, not Him as important. So we should have them, He should be here and they should be here, not this or not this. Okay? That's the first thing. The second thing is, you'll notice that our Haftorah portion from Ezekiel says that the Kohanim are the ones who are supposed to educate the people, not the rabbis. The rabbinic teaching coming from the first century gave us, in my estimation, I'll say it this way, Rabbinic Judaism is the best, hear what I'm going to say, Rabbinic Judaism is the best man-made religion there ever was. It's the best man-made religion there ever was. Only problem is it's man-made. But it's the best out there of all the man-made ones. Rabbinic Judaism, because they anchored a lot of things they said in the Torah. Not everything, but a lot. So they moved away from it here and there, but it's the best one out there. But the biblical text tells us that the Kohanim are the ones that were supposed to be the ones educating the people, not the rabbis. So the priests were supposed to learn the Torah and to study the Torah so that they could teach the Torah to the people. That was one of their primary functions and roles. We find out they didn't do that. We can talk about that a little bit later. But that's two things right off the chute. These things belong to Him. These festivals, these Moedim, these appointed times belong to Him. So when we do them to honor Him and to set aside this time to honor Him. And from our text in Ezekiel, that the Kohanim, the priests, were the ones who were supposed to educate the people. Not the rabbis, not the sages. Nothing wrong with having them give commentary. Nothing wrong with having them give their understanding. Nothing wrong in that in of itself. But the bottom line is, the ones who are supposed to teach the people and that were charged to teach the people are the Kohanim. All right, any questions? Yeah.
Okay, when Babylon sacked the temple, what happened to the records of who the Kohanim are?
They got lost. They got burned. This became a problem because, if you'll remember, Ezra, who is a priest, has his credentialing. And he can show his papers and say, look, I'm a Kohanim. I can prove I'm a Kohanim. He tells the exiles that are returning, if you're a Kohanim, come to me and show me your paperwork, and then you can minister to the people. Well, the difficulty was that many of them had lost it in the shuffle. Look, we had the same thing happen. We had the same thing happen in the Holocaust. All these people had records, but having to leave on a moment's notice or having to take these from camp to camp, they got lost, they got burned, things happened to them. Here's a classic example of this. We had a number of Jewish people into the millions that had insurance policies with European insurance companies. But they couldn't prove, since there was no death certificates issued in the camps, they couldn't prove their survivors couldn't prove that they were dead, and therefore these insurance companies wouldn't pay out because there's no death certificate. How do we know that how do we know that they're not alive? You tell us they're dead. Where's the death certificate? Well, we don't have one. Their body was incinerated. Nobody was issuing death certificates. Therefore, we can't help you. Okay. So this has been going on for a while. Well, the same thing in a sense with these records. When they get lost because of different pogroms and different issues, Ezra says, look, guys, and here's Ezra's point. I'm not saying you're not a Kohanim. I'm just saying until I have proof, I can't move forward with you. You may well be. He was saying to the people, you may well be a Kohanim. I just can't move forward until I have documented proof of your genealogy. Okay. Now, here's what's fascinating. Fast forward to, we go back about 2006-7. I mentioned this before. A man who is a geneticist, named David Kleeman. He believes that they have isolated the Kohanim genome. So there's 24 markers. They took samples from people all over. It's called DNA and Tradition. This is the name of the book, DNA and Tradition. And they took samples from people all over the world, and these individuals had the same genetic markers and said they were Kohanim. They claimed to have genealogical records that allowed them to prove they were Kohanim. Okay? And by the way, this word Kohen can be spelled a number of ways. You could see it Cohen, Khn, with a C, with a K, Kohen, Coen. I mean, it can be spelled a lot of ways. I've seen it spelled many different ways. But bottom line is, it still has the same basic root letters. But you should read his book, DNA and Tradition, because it's a fascinating book from the genetic side of things, where just taking a swab from inside somebody's mouth, saliva, they can say, hey, look, this guy over here and this guy over here, removed from each other by thousands of miles, are genetically connected to each other. And they both say they're Cohen. Now, it excluded some people, which just meant they weren't a Cohen. Didn't mean that they weren't a Jew or an Israelite, just meant that they weren't a Cohen. Okay? So that the isolation of that is fascinating to me. What if, and I guess I've said this before, what if, all these other tribes, what if we can say, look, we can swab the mouth and we can figure out with the genetic markers that you are involved, you are connected to this particular tribe. It's fascinating that we have the technology now, the DNA technology to do this, that God's thumbprint, DNA thumbprint, is still there. That hasn't gone away. So it's carried in the genetics, and they can say, okay, look, we know who's who, which would be a great thing. Instead of having a documentation, because paper documentation may have gotten lost, we can say, hey, let's just swab the inside of your mouth, and if you're connected to these people, then okay. K.L. Kleeman is K-L-I-E-M-A-N, David Kleeman, and it's called DNA and Tradition. Fascinating work on the genetic side of biology, what they're doing with this, mapping these genomes. Yes?
Just to kind of put the other side to it, when they have the DNA in the wrong hands, they can use that as genocide.
Sure.
So, I mean,
It's a potential problem.
I'm sure one day it will.
Yes.
And I was actually just did a little research on that the other day. Maybe not the same person, but someone else doing the same thing. And there's ways actually around that too. I don't know if everyone's doing that, but there's ways where you can have your identity classified or removed, where all they do is you pay for whatever your services are. You don't give them a name. They just take your DNA, and they actually put it to a number, and you receive all the stuff, but they don't have a name with it.
Yeah. You can do it blind. So there are ways to do it blind. Yeah. If it's truly blind, but that's difficult, but yeah. Right. All right. So any other questions or comments regarding the Moedim? So what we're looking at is the regulation of time. We have the spring festivals. We have the fall festivals. We're getting ready to come up to the next major festival on the night of May 14th through the night of May 15th. We'll be here at lunchtime on the 15th In Hebrew, it's called Shavuot, which means weeks. In Greek, it's known as Pentecost. 50. Pentecost meaning 50. When the children of Israel left Egypt, that's Passover. Then they come 50 days later to Mount Sinai. So Shavuot commemorates the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. So that's the next major festival on the calendar, is Shavuot, coming up May 14th through the night of May 15th. We'll be here for lunch on the 15th. So it's a fascinating thing. Did you notice that in the reading of Leviticus 23, how he says, if you come to the corners of your field, leave the corners of your field for the poor and those who don't have anything. Okay? So in other words, each of these festivals, why that's slapped right in the middle of Leviticus 23 is for this reason. Most of the biblical festivals occurred during times of harvest. So it made sense that they would praise God and he would have them meet at these times where the harvest was coming in. Barley harvest, wheat harvest. And the book that we will read at the time of, one of the things we'll study is Psalm 119, but we'll also study the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth is set at the time of the barley harvest. Okay, so we'll see that that book has a lot of ties in with the, by the way, how does the book of Ruth end? The book of Ruth ends messianically with a genealogy connecting it to David. Connecting it right at the end of all this narrative. We have a genealogy, and the key person that's the most important in all this is David. Segue. Go with me to some text that we're going to look at talking about David. Go with me to Isaiah chapter 9. Isaiah chapter 9. These are texts that focus on David long after David is gone. So we have Saul, David, Solomon. So the middle of the first three kings, go with me to Isaiah chapter 9. Isaiah chapter 9. And we're going to begin our reading in verse 2. Look what he says. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 2. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in the land of the shadow of death, upon them a light has shined. You have multiplied the nation and increased its joy. They rejoice before you, according to the joy of harvest, as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. For you have broken the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, as in the day of Midian. For every warrior's sandal from the noisy battle and garments rolled in blood will be used for burning and fuel of fire. Look at verse 6. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder. And his name will be called Pele Yoetz, Wonderful Counselor, El Gibor, Mighty God, Ad Olam, Everlasting Father, and Sar Shalom, Prince of Peace. Of the increase, now look at this, of the increase of his government and peace, no end. Upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order and establish it with judgment and justice. From that time forward, even forever, the zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. David is coming. There's a David coming. He's a son, a child. Fascinating text. This David who's coming. Go with me to Jeremiah chapter 23. Isaiah, go over just one book to Jeremiah chapter 23. Jeremiah chapter 23. These are Davidic texts speaking of the coming David. Look, this is the Lord speaking. Verse 5 says, verse 5, Jeremiah 23:5. Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, that I will raise to David a branch of righteousness. A king shall reign and prosper. In his days, Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell safely. Now this is his name by which he will be called, the Lord our righteousness. Okay. Now go with me to Ezekiel chapter 37. Ezekiel chapter 37 and verse 24. Ezekiel chapter 37, look at verse 24. David, My servant shall be king over them, and they shall all have one shepherd. They shall also walk in my judgments and observe my statutes and do them. Then they shall dwell in the land that I have given to Jacob my servant, where your fathers dwelt, and they will dwell there, they, their children, and their children's children forever. And my servant David shall be their prince forever. Moreover, I will make a covenant of peace with them, and it shall be an everlasting covenant with them. I will establish them and multiply them, and I will set my sanctuary in their midst forever. My tabernacle also shall be with them. Indeed, I will be their God, and they shall be my people. The nations will know that I, the Lord, sanctify Israel. Now listen to this. When my sanctuary is in their midst forevermore. How important is the temple? Pretty important. Twice here he mentions the temple and the importance of it. Okay? Go with me to Hosea chapter 3. Hosea chapter 3 and verse 5. Hosea chapter 3 and verse 5. He says this. Hosea 3:5. Afterward, the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. David's been dead a long time. They shall fear the Lord and his goodness in the latter days. So, this inauguration of a king who is Davidic will set up his rule and he will reign, and Israel will dwell in security. All these messianic prophecies regarding this David who is to come, long after King David has died, long after he's deceased. So this comes to our texts from last week. We have the rule of God, which is the Torah, the reign of God, which is the King David, and then chapter 3. Go with me to chapter 3 of Psalm, the book of Psalms. Chapter 3. This particular psalm opens with the superscription, Psalm 3, one of the few psalms that actually has a superscription, and it says, a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom his son. So I've given you in your handout psalms that are attributed to an event in the life of David. Okay? This is one of them. Okay, now here's the whole list of all the superscriptions that list some type of activity or text related to the life of David, okay, that we know of, that we can actually put down and see. And so it goes all the way, Psalm 7, 18, 34, 51, 52, 54, 56. They cluster in the 50s, from 51 all the way to 60, 63, and then they skip to 142. Okay, on the back of the page, it skips to 142. So this particular text, anybody know where? Well, I told you already, never mind. David flees from Absalom, 2 Samuel 15 to 16. Okay? David is the king. His son Absalom rebels against him and leads a rebellion to the point that David has to leave Jerusalem. And he flees Jerusalem. And the whole story is based on the narrative there in 2 Samuel 15 to 16. Okay? Now, chapter 3 is a lament, and I've given you the handout called the 5 elements of a lament psalm using Psalm 3. Definition of a lament: an individual appeal to God for deliverance from a threatening life situation that may include physical or emotional stress. So here's the invocation. First we have the invocation. It'll say something like, O Lord, or my God. Okay, he starts off in chapter 3, O Lord, how they have increased who trouble me. The complaint, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying to me, And here's what they're saying. There is no help or salvation for you in God. The petition, rise up, deliver me. Verse 7, the expression of trust. But you, O Lord, are a shield around me, my glory and the one who lifts my head. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy hill. I lie down and sleep. I wake again, for the Lord sustains me. I am not afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me all around. For you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. And then this expression of praise. Deliverance belongs to the Lord. May your blessing be on your people. At times, one or two elements may be missing from a lament psalm, but this should alert us and force us to ask why that element is missing. On occasion, a lament psalm will add the element of imprecation, which is defined by the psalmist asking God to bring judgment and justice to enemies who are perpetual adversaries to the psalmist or the people of God. All right, now, last week we looked at Psalm 1 and 2, so I want to go back just for a second. Psalm 1 and 2 talks about the Torah. Psalm 1 talks about the Torah. Psalm 2 talks about the king. What would connect these two together within the Torah? What text would connect these two? The king and the Torah. You're supposed to read the Torah? Okay, there we go. Go with me to Deuteronomy chapter 17. Deuteronomy chapter 17. You're probably right, they were supposed to read it too. Deuteronomy 17. Exactly. Here we go. Deuteronomy 17 and verse 14. This is a text, again, that you should have marked in your Bible. Deuteronomy 17:14. Speaking of the king and his relationship to the Torah. When you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you and possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your brethren you shall set as a king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother. But he shall not multiply. By the way, that means automatically that the Messiah, when he comes, if he's going to be in the descendant of David, has to be Jewish Israeli, okay? If he's going to be king. So this is why you can't have somebody coming from the outside. It's right here. This to be chosen of God. One he chooses, and one who is a descendant of Israel. So right there, the chosenness of God and descendant of Israel eliminates a lot of people. He says this, but he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. By the way, if you read 1 Kings 1-11, Solomon found the way to do all three of these. Now, I will say this for Solomon. Solomon gets a bad rap, and in some ways rightly so, although he did build the temple. That he had more than 1,000 wives. But you have to understand how the ancient Near East worked. Solomon had more than 1,000 wives. He probably never saw most of them. I'll tell you why. In the ancient Near East, you establish a treaty between you and another nation. When you establish the treaty, one of the things you would do is to give one of your women to them, and they would give you one of their women. As a way of saying, our people are now connected, so you won't attack us because we have one of you and you have one of us. So it was an ancient Near Eastern way of thinking. Okay, I'm not saying I like the idea, that I approve of the idea. I'm just telling you the way things worked. So these 1,000 wives that Solomon had were because he established treaties with other nations. So every nation that he established a treaty with would give him another wife. I said most of them he probably never saw. Okay? So, but the point was, don't multiply silver or gold. That is, don't put your trust in finances. Don't multiply horses or chariots. That is, in armies. And don't put your trust in making treaties. That's why you're not to multiply wives. Don't think that if you establish all these treaties with people, that that's going to be your security. And Solomon did all three. Okay? Here's what he's supposed to do, though. Verse 18. Also it shall be when he sits on the throne of his kingdom that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in the book from before the priest, the Levites. The Levites are supposed to be the ones to help him write this. They read it out to him, and he copies it down. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it, there it is, all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and be careful to observe all the words of this Torah and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, and that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. Okay, so he's supposed to write one and read it every day. So the king is supposed to be a Torah scholar. If he reads it every day, writes one, he's going to get good at this. That's the hope. And he'll not think he's better than his brethren, won't elevate himself. Okay, and the Levites are supposed to help him write it. Okay, everybody with me on this? Any questions or comments? I know you, when he said he had 1,000 wives, that kind of boggles the mind, I know, but that's, sorry. Huh? A lot of child support, yeah. So, it is what it is. That's Solomon's problem. But he gets, like I said, 1 Kings 1 to 11, he basically gets a lot of flack from God over this, and rightly so. Well, you know what ended up happening? What ended up happening because of Solomon's bringing in these foreign wives, it said that many of these foreign wives they brought their foreign gods with them. And it continually led his heart astray. They would say, they would come to Solomon and say, hey, can I build a little shrine to my God? And he would say, well, sure, go ahead. And Israel was inundated with these shrines from foreign gods because of all these different foreign women that came in. So, women. Okay, no, I'm sorry. All right, so that was David. So go with me now to Psalm 3. He should never have married them. Okay, look at this. Look what the text says. Now, remember what we said last week, that the Psalms are talking to the texts before them and after them. So look what he says here. He says, Lord, how they have increased who trouble me. Many are those who rise up against me. Many are those who say of me, there is no help for him in God. Underline that word, help, because it's the word Yeshuatah, salvation or deliverance. You should underline that because we're going to see that word again in this text. There is no help or no salvation for him. This is what they're saying. Your God isn't going to help you. And notice it says many have, how they have increased. That word increased is the same root for the word many who rise up against me and many who say of me. So somebody is speaking against the king. And in the context, it's those who have attached themselves to Absalom. If you go back and look at 2 Samuel. He says, so there is no help for him in God. That word help is Yeshuatah. We'll come back to that. He says, but you, O Lord, are a shield for me, my glory, and the one who lifts up my head. Now, I mentioned for you in the Psalms, and you can take this handout right here called the Metaphor of Refuge in the book of Psalms. The Metaphor of Refuge. He's a shield. This word for shield is the word magen. Okay? It's a small shield, not the full body shield. The Psalms repeatedly talk to us about God being a fortress. And I've given you the text here. He's a rock, a shield, a fortress, a shelter, a shadow, a stronghold. Another word for fortress, another word for rock, another word for high dwelling, a migdal, a strong tower, and then manos, a place of safety. I mean, I've given you all the references and places where they're used. I mean, over and over again in the Psalms, he speaks of God being this shelter and this refuge, this rock, this place where you can run in times of distress. Yes? I don't know. I would need to go and look a little more closely to see. What I do know is this: the armor that Paul is talking about in Ephesians 6 is armor that's used in Isaiah by Yahweh. So I would connect them up with that. I don't know if the language is the same as far as the same word or not. I'd need to look. I don't know. That's a good question. Very good question. Now look what he says. He says, "You are a shield for me." That is, you're my protector, my glory, and the one who lifts up my head. What does that language sound like? This one who lifts up my head. It's the one, when one would go in before a king. When you went in before a king, if the king said you had to walk in before the king with your head down, if he asked you to lift up your head, that was his willingness to grant you a request. He's the one who lifts my head. He would say, lift your head. You didn't look at him. Okay? But if he said, lift your head, then you got to see him. That was his way of saying, I'm open to a request. Yeah.
It's like in Joseph when he had the dreams.
Yes.
One had his left to the top, and the other one was lifted up and disconnected.
Exactly. One is literal, one's metaphorical. He's going to lift your head. He's going to restore you. He's going to show favor to you. He says, my glory and the one who lifts my head. He said, verse 4, I cried to the Lord with my voice, and he heard me from his holy hill. Now, note his holy hill. Go over to Psalm 2 and look at verse 6. Look at verse 6. I have set my king on my holy hill of Zion. I have set my king on my holy hill. My holy hill is the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And it also became known as Zion. Now here's the funny thing. It's a mountain, but it's not a very big mountain. If you sit on the southern steps of Jerusalem, because of where it's at, the southern steps, you can see the mountains all around you. But they're not what we would call mountains. They're more like hills. Okay? I mean, look, you have Mount Rainier. It's huge. It's majestic. Okay? There's nothing like that in Israel, but there's hills, but they call them mountains. But the point is that the hills are all around Jerusalem. And Zion, or my holy hill, was thought of, since we're talking about the tabernacle, it's the presence and dwelling of God. And this is where one would want to go. How does David end Psalm 23? And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That's, in a sense, that's his view of heaven. Think about that. Their view of heaven was, I could dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I mean, what we would call heaven. Look at Psalm 27. Look at Psalm 27. Psalm 27, the 27th Tehillim, he says, verse 4, one thing I have desired of the Lord, that I will seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord, and to inquire in his temple. From the ancient Near Eastern perspective, from the perspective of the Israelites, nothing could be more godly, nothing could be more righteous than to think that the rest of your life you could spend it in the temple. And where do we find, the first time we find Yeshua, where is he at? He's sitting in the temple. Not in a manger, yes, okay. You're right, he's in a manger. A sukkah. Aha! You such a pagan. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, not a manger, but a sukkah. But you're right. But the next time we see him, when he's 12 years old, he's sitting in the temple. And he says, I must be about my Father's business. Didn't you know where to find me? If you knew the Psalms, you'd know where to find me, Mom. I'm not out running around Jerusalem. I'm at one place. I'm in my Father's house. Why? This is where the glory of God resides. This is where the presence of God resides. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. One thing I have desired, that I may dwell in this place forever. And so the Psalms are replete with this concept of Zion and the holy hill. That's where one wants to go. Look at verse 5. He says, I lay down and slept. I awoke, for the Lord sustained me. That language right there is very similar now to, look at Psalm 4, verse 8. Psalm 4, verse 8. Same language. He says, I will both lie down in peace and sleep. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. Do you know people who, because of all of the anxiety, who because all of the fear, because all of the trepidation of life, can't sleep? Sleep leaves them. David says, you know what? I trust in my God. I can lay down and sleep, and everything's going to be fine. I know that God is still on the throne. I know that the king still reigns, and everything will be fine. So Psalm 4, verse 8, jumps us forward. Now he says this. He says, I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me all around. Wow, you think you got troubles. Try being a king on the run with an army chasing you. He says, verse 7, arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. That phrase right there, save me, O my God, is the same word, same root we had in verse, where did I say it was at? Verse 2, thank you. There is no help for him in God. So the word help in verse 2 and the word save me in verse 7. Okay? And then he says, arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you have struck, now look at this, for you have struck all my enemies on the cheekbone. You have broken the teeth of the ungodly. This is what we call in Hebrew, midah v'midah, measure for measure. They spoke against him, and now the imprecation is, may God smite them on the cheek, and may God crush their teeth. Wow. In a couple weeks, we're going to have a gentleman here, my friend John Day, Dr. John Day, speaking on the Imprecatory Psalms. Many of my evangelical brothers and sisters do not like the Imprecatory Psalms, those psalms that call for God's judgment. In fact, many evangelicals have been writing and saying these particular psalms that are very harsh. I mean, listen to this language. Nobody puts this on a t-shirt. You have struck all my enemies on the cheekbone. You have broken the teeth of the ungodly. How's that for a t-shirt? You know? On a coffee mug. Coffee mugs. Those would be great. I say we have a whole new line of imprecatory psalms on t-shirts and coffee mugs. Yeah, remember 9/11. Why do we have these psalms where the psalmist is saying, strike them on the cheek, so strike them on the cheek and break the teeth of the ungodly? Where does the theology for this come from? I was just speaking with one of the most educated evangelicals on the Psalms recently. We were in Chicago, and I said to him, I noticed that your commentary, very extensive commentary, and very good, by the way. I said, I noticed your commentary doesn't have anything about the Imprecatory Psalms. Well, not the commentary, but a little booklet he wrote on the Psalms that's being used in seminaries all over the world. And I said, I noticed that your book didn't have anything on the Imprecatory Psalms. He says, yeah, well, I didn't really want to go into that. And I said, okay. And I said, well, what's your view of the Imprecatory Psalms? He says, those are about the kingdom of Israel, and it's a different theodicy, and I find it uncomfortable to try to incorporate those into modern Christianity. Okay. I said, well, what do you do then? What do you do with the fact that the tribulation saints underneath the altar in the book of Revelation are calling down imprecations on those who are here on earth. And he says, I don't know what to do with that. That's what he said to me. I mean, he's honest. I mean, I'll give him that. He's honest. I said, you have another problem. I said, we have other individuals in the apostolic scriptures who are calling down fire and brimstone and imprecations on other people. And he goes, yeah, I know. You're right. He goes, you're absolutely right. He says, I don't know what to do with it. That's what he says to me. Now, this is, I don't want to say, not publicly. Yeah, I mean, the thing is this. He's a very, very, I have no doubt in my mind whatsoever that this man is redeemed. I have no doubt that he's a believer. Strong faith. Very strong faith. But what do we do with these? Because somebody forgot to take them out. In the editing process, they got left in there. And now the question becomes, what do we do with them? Now here's what happens. Most denominations have lectionary readings of the Psalms. And you know what happens? These verses get left out. They just don't read them. Nobody ever hears these in public reading. Nobody hears these in a song. Nobody hears these in reading. And they just kind of go away. They're pushed to the margins. They're just neglected. Where does the theology for these Psalms come from? Let me submit to you that when David prays these prayers, and others within the Psalms pray these prayers, first of all, they're asking for God to do it. That's the first thing. They're asking God to do it. And second of all, they're only asking for those things to happen to these other people that have happened to them. They're not asking for beyond, they're asking for measure. Okay? And they're going back and looking at the promises that God had given to his people in Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26 and saying, God, you said you would do these things, now do them. One of the most bizarre texts in all of Scripture, here it is. If you want a bizarre text, is one of the prophets, and I forget whether it's Elijah or Elisha right now, I'm not remembering, but it's one of the two. The text says that some boys, oh, thank you, Elisha. They come out and they say, go up, Baldy, go up. And they call him Baldy. And they say to him, go up, go up. And he calls out she-bears from the woods, and they come, these bears, he calls God and says, God, send bears out of the woods to destroy them. Well, I know, I'm getting to that. So he says, so these bears, these mother bears, come out of the woods and maul these 42 of them, boys, and kills them. And you look at this text and you go, so this guy's a cranky old prophet. They just, they basically come out and they go, nah, 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 nah. And he gets a little cranky and goes, okay, God, send bears out to kill 42 of them. And it happens. That's the crazy part. All right, let's go back and unpack that a little bit. Here's an imprecation. First of all, they're called boys. They're probably a little bit older than just boys. Then they tell them to go up. By the way, why to go up? Because they had just seen Elijah go up, which means take off. In other words, you take off too. You go up. So it wasn't just get out of here. It was more like, we don't want you on this planet either. And baldy was a term of derision because to have hair was to be, in God's favor, so to speak. To have your hair cut or to lose your hair was considered a disgrace in their culture. So it's a term of derision. And the fact that he's able to call these bears out of the woods comes from the Torah, where the Torah said, those of my prophets, people who speak against my prophets, wild animals will come out of the woods and destroy them. How about that one? It's in the Torah. if somebody speaks against my prophets, I will allow for wild animals to come out of the woods and destroy them. And the prophet said, okay, you 42 people, creeps, you tell me to take off and get out of here, and you treat me with scorn. He calls down an imprecation and says, okay, God, bring out the bears. And bears come out and maul these 42 individuals based on his prayer. Yes?
So imagine if that's what God does for people who speak out against prophets, what we do to speak out against him.
Yeah, exactly. He's capable of doing that and much more. But he says in the Torah, I will allow for wild animals to come out and destroy those who speak against my prophets. And the prophet, hearing these individuals speak of him in terms of derision and speak of him in terms of not wanting him around, says, okay, God. He could have just left it alone. But the prophet actually says, okay, God, bring out the animals, the wild animals, and destroy them. And the wild animals come out of the woods and destroy them. That's what the text says. I can't make this stuff up. It's too good. My point is, it's imprecation. It's judgment. Measure for measure. Okay? We'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the coming weeks. Yeah, because what they did was they spoke against the prophet. If you have this high office, I mean, if you look at the prophet and you look at the king, if you speak against the prophet or the king, it's considered a high crime. It's treasonous. It's almost in the category of treason, because you're speaking against somebody who God gives the immediate revelation to. So God says, hey, look, if you speak against this individual, there are certain ones that are it's a high crime. In other words, once you do that particular thing, then it elevates it to this category where you have spoken against to the point that, huh? Yeah, it's actually against God, because you're actually taking his spokesman and saying, I reject the word of God. In other words, it's like saying, I reject the ultimate king. Because the prophet speaks on behalf of God, and to reject his message. Now, sometimes the measure for measure will actually be in the very same way. In other words, here's measure for measure in Esther, for instance. We have Haman, who builds this gallows and for other people, and ironically, he's hung on the gallows. Okay, on this very same gallows that he had designed for somebody else. So you often see this kind of measure for measure, but I say measure for measure in the sense that the punishment fits the crime, because it's a crime against God to go against his prophet, the mouthpiece of God. You're basically rejecting not just the prophet, you're rejecting God, because he's speaking on behalf of God. Yeah.
The question was, what theology was this guy missing? I think that missing theology is really important. The theology is God's a warrior king. He commands every host.
Yes, I'm glad you segued to that. Thank you. Go with me to Isaiah. Just for a moment, I want to show you a text you guys should have written down. Isaiah chapter 37. Isaiah chapter 37. Look at this. Here's a text for you. You should mark this. It says, this is about Assyria. Okay, so Assyria has come against Israel. 37, and we're going to look at verse 33. Start in verse 33. You should mark this down. I mean, this is one of those texts that you just, to get your mind wrapped around the numbers here, listen to this. This is verse 33. Now remember the context. Assyria is coming against Israel. So God speaks to the king, to Hezekiah, and says this to him. Verse 33. Therefore thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into this city, nor shoot an arrow there, nor come before it with shield, nor build a siege mount against it. By the way that he came, by the same shall he return. And he shall not come into this city, says the Lord, for I will defend this city to save it. Now look at this. For my own sake and for my servant David's sake. David's been dead a long time. Who's this David? Keeps popping up. Then the angel of the Lord went out and killed in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when the people arose early in the morning, there were corpses all dead. Wow. How do you deal with an angel of the Lord who has a sword and nobody can see him? So he's able to go through the camp, and in one night, I mean, this guy's so stealth that the person dying next to the next person doesn't even know how it happened. When you can't see them or you can't hear him, you can't defend yourself. He's just on you and you're dead before you even know what happened. And he takes out 185,000. Wow. I mean, you can't fit 100,000 people. Think of filling up Quest Field twice. Think of filling it up twice. And that's how many people he killed in one night. Wow. About the rest of you, but to me, that's amazing. That's incredible. And like I said, the person next to the person dying doesn't even know how it happened. And then before they realize it, they're dead. Sure, could be. But it says, it kind of indicates, it says, he went out and killed in the camp. So, I mean, how he did it, I don't know. But wow, doesn't matter, 185,000. And this king of Assyria is going to go back the same way he came. I'll defend you. Yes. Yeah, Assyria tells the story, and they kind of try to deal with the fact that they lost 185,000 soldiers. So it's very interesting to hear it from their side. By the way, that's another interesting thing to do, is to listen to the other side, tell their story about how this all happens. I'll give you an example of that. In Israel, we have a case where, and this is great because we have the other side to it. Misha, the king of Moab, the Israelite army pushes all the way back into Moab, into the city, and here's how the ancient Near Eastern peoples thought. If Misha goes up on the wall, and the children of Israel have him surrounded, he goes up on the wall and he sacrifices the crown prince to his god, to Molech. And the children of Israel look around, and here's what happens to them. They go, this is their thinking, we are in Moabite territory. The Moabite god is the god of this territory. They're very territorial in their understanding of the gods. Israel has this understanding as well. We saw it earlier. Remember when Naaman from Syria comes in, what does he say? After he's healed, he says to the prophet, can I take 2 mule loads of dirt back to Syria so I can worship your God in my land? If I have some of your land in my land, I can worship your God there. It's very superstitious, but this is how they think. So Israel pushes all the way back into Moab. They chase the army back all the way behind the city walls. He gets on the top of the wall, Misha does. And those of you that have been to Israel, some of these walls in some of these areas are huge. They're tall. I mean, they scale way above an average person's height. I mean, they're as high as this ceiling sometimes. He gets up on the wall where everybody can see him, and he plunges a knife into the crown prince, killing him, sacrificing him to his God. And the children of Israel are overtaken with fear, and they pull back. And when the Moabites tell the story, they say, we sacrificed our crown prince, and Chemosh, our God, fought for us. And therefore, this is why the children of Israel were defeated, or we were not defeated by them, is because our God fought for us. And it says that the anger of the Lord was kindled against the children of Israel. But they pulled back because they said, we're in their territory. And maybe their God will fight for them now, especially now that the crown prince has been sacrificed. This will invoke their God. They feared their God, the God of Chemosh, more than they feared their own God. All right, go back to Psalm 3. Psalm chapter 3. Look at the last verse. Here it is again. Here's our word. Salvation belongs to the Lord. That's it. Salvation belongs to the Lord. We've had it 3 times. We've had it in verse 2, there is no salvation for him in God. Then in verse 8, verse 7, arise, O Lord, save me or deliver me, O my God. And in verse 8, salvation belongs to the Lord. It belongs to him. That's a great, and by the way, I keep saying this, so metaphorically, our salvation, I want to put this in the metaphorical context, our salvation is something that belongs to him. In other words, we have been told all of our lives, you need to accept Jesus Christ as your personal Savior. My point is this, that the salvation he provides for us is not about us, but it's about him. It benefits us, it blesses us, but ultimately our salvation is about his kingdom and about his rule. We have made it about us. But salvation belongs to him. Deliverance belongs to him. Nobody is delivered without him. Yes. It's his sovereignty, to be sure. Now look at the progression. If I could put it in R's, using the letter R, we've had the rule of God, which is Torah. We have the reign of God, which is this king who is the Son, chapter 2. Then chapter 3, we've had the rebellion, Absalom's rebellion. So the rule of God, the reign of God, and the rebellion. By the way, that's just exactly how things worked out if we go back to Genesis. We have the Torah of God, the rule of God. Do not eat from this tree. The rule of God. Adam, you can do you get to rule and reign as my co-regents. And what do we end up having? Rebellion. No, we won't do what God has said. And you know why the rebellion came? We were talking about this last night. One of the reasons why the rebellion came was this. That if you look at how Eve deals with the Scriptures, she doesn't know the Scriptures. She doesn't know she confuses and changes what God said. She adds to it. She takes a little bit away. She misquotes and misrepresents the text. And that misrepresentation and misquotation of the text will get us in trouble every time. We have to know what the text says, not getting it wrong. It's vital. It's pivotal. It's core. My people perish for lack of knowledge. You know the reason why we continually have problems is because we trample on the commandments of God and we don't even know we're doing so. Yes. I think it's specific to Revelation personally. That's my own take. She's asking about at the end of the book of Revelation, it says, no one who adds or takes away from this book, all the curses will happen to them. And I take it to be the book of Revelation, not to be the rest of Scripture, because I think it's contextually defined there. But that's my own take. Yeah, it's in Micah 2. Yes. Different quotation there, though. Yes.
You say she didn't quote the text. Was the text written?
Well, what she knew orally, what she's told by God. What they're told, for instance, she's told that you may freely eat from all the other trees. She says we may eat. She diminishes it. Then later on she adds. She says we're told not to touch it. Never says that the text never says they can't touch it. So there's addition, there's subtraction. So all the way down the line, there's miscommunication here on her part at some level, whether that's because of Adam or her failure or whatever. Wherever one wants to place the failure, the Word of God was not dealt with accurately as you look at it, because He tells them you may freely eat from all these trees. She says, we may eat from these trees. It takes out the word freely, which diminishes God's abundance and God's desire to give them everything except for that one tree.
So they had to know the Torah, because without the Torah, there's no sin.
Right. It's oral. I'll admit that. It's oral in the sense that God is giving it. But by the way, there's those that have problems with this, but here's the text for it. Genesis 26. Genesis 26 and verse 5. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, my Torah, my laws. How does Abraham know this? Very same way. Yes, ma'am. He knows it. Hold on just a second. He knows it because Adam walked with God, Enoch walked with God, Abraham walked with God, and when they walked with God, he talked with them. He told them, this is what I want you to do. Yes? Good question. You hear that? Why did God plant the tree if he didn't want them to eat it? Very good question. Brilliant question. I think the answer to that question is this. He has to give Adam and Eve a chance to see if they will be obedient to him. Will they, if he tells them not to do something, will they be obedient to that? Will they do what he says? They can eat from every tree in the garden. He says, from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you can't eat. Okay? Yeah, and God tests people to see if they'll be obedient. Will you do what I have asked you to do? Wanting them to be obedient, hoping that they will do the right thing. It's always his hope that they'll do the right thing. That they'll be obedient to him and do what he asked them to do. In this instance, they don't do that. And that's been the history of mankind up to this day, is that when God asks us to do something, most of the time we ignore it or do what we want to do anyway. And that's the purpose of our community, is to say, hey, let's come back to the things God has said and let's do them. Yes? Yes. Now, she brings up the question of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This tree of the knowledge of good and evil, these trees show up back in the book of Revelation. Okay? So, once again, God is going to let us eat from this tree at some future date. There will be a future date when we will be able to be around that tree and eat from it. So it's coming back. And at the end of the age, it will come back. The beginning is in the end. Okay? But that's a great question. Very good question. Why does God have to put it there if he's going to tell them not to eat from it? Because he's testing us to see, will you do what I've asked you to do? The rule of God, the Torah, the reign of God, this coming king, this coming David. The king must learn the Torah. He must study the Torah. He must know the Torah. By the way, that tells us something about who the king will be. He'll be a Torah scholar. The true king will be a Torah scholar. Which is why he can't do away with it. He's going to rule from it. Do we get that? That he's going to write his own Torah scroll. This king who comes will already have written his own Torah scroll. He's the man of God's own choosing already. He's an Israelite, man of God's choosing. He already knows the Torah because he wrote the Torah. So, the kingship of God and the rule of God are tied up with the Torah all the way through. Chapter 3 brings us to the rebellion. The rebellion happens, no doubt. Now, how does God work around this rebellion? And the answer is this. It will not come through an earthly king. It will come through a spiritual king. This is why we keep talking about King David, this David who is to come. This one who is, in the words of Isaiah 9, he is El Gibor, mighty God. Ad Olam, everlasting Father. Sar Shalom, Prince of Peace. He's this one who is beyond everyone else. He's a mighty warrior, El Gibor. He's a mighty warrior. So, we need to think about who this one is. And what I'm saying is, this is why when we get to the apostolic scriptures, the first thing the text does, is to say, we must genealogically connect this one who is coming with David. So the 14 sets, the genealogy is set in 3 sets of 14, because the numerical value of David's number is 14. works this way. We give a number to every letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet. 4. David, Dalet, 4. Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav. Middle letter of his name, Vav. 6. 4, 6, back to Dalet, 4. 14. So the genealogies are set in 14 to say, this is about David. This is the David to come. We've been talking about him. The prophets were talking about him all the time. And here's what's going to happen when he comes. Although, you'll see there's a problem. You have it right there in Isaiah. Go back to Isaiah 9 for just a moment, real quick. Isaiah chapter 9 creates the dilemma. Isaiah chapter 9, look at how he's described again. It says this in 9 verse 6. He says, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. His name will be called," now look at this, Pele Yoetz. Pele Yoetz. That's interesting because the angel of the Lord is on a couple times called Pele. He says, when he's asked what his name is, he says, "My name's too wonderful. It's Pele." Okay, we could connect that up with the angel of the Lord. He says, so it's wonderful counselor. Then he says this, El Gibor, mighty God. So he's a warrior, bringing a sword. Ad Olam, everlasting Father. So his origin is from eternity past. He has no beginning or end. And then the conundrum, he's a Sar Shalom, he's a Prince of Peace. Well now, how can he be a mighty warrior and a Prince of Peace? Let me suggest to you that we're dealing with two comings. He came first as a man of peace, establishing reconciliation, and will come again as a warrior, and will wipe out those who fight against him.
Well, peace isn't necessarily the lack of conflict.
Exactly, not a lack of conflict, but it's the idea of peace is wholeness and the way things are supposed to be. But what I'm saying is, there will be no conflict when he finally does everything the way it's supposed to be.
When you talk about the twisted theology with changing the words, I think that the twisted theology we see is you just listed all the names of the mighty warrior. They can then sit down to God is love. So you say God is love, and that by default that means he's not a warrior. He's not going to. People aren't going to die.
Right.
No consequence.
Right.
There's no consequence to sin because God is love.
Right. Well, that's why you have difficulty with the book of Revelation, because at that point he says he's got a sword strapped on his side. He's riding a white horse, and it says he has an army of horses behind him. And basically what he says is, "Okay, guys, I'm giving you the day off. I'll take this one," just like he does in Isaiah, where the angel of the Lord takes 185,000 and does it himself. He doesn't need anybody else's help. He can use Israel's army if he wants to, or any other army for that matter. He has an army of stars. So the stars and their constellations are his army. He can mess with the heavenly celestial bodies and do anything he wants to. If he brings all God has to do is touch the moon, dip the moon a little bit, and everything's back underwater again. That's all he has to do. Just gently touch the moon. Take the sun, move it a little bit closer. Just move it a little bit closer, and you got a scorched earth. Move it a little bit further away, we're all covered in ice. Okay, so, yeah. I mean, my point is this: that the stars are part of his army as well. The army of Israel, the army of angels, and the army of stars. All of them are at his command, and he can use any one of them or all of them at any given time. And this is a message that's not being spoken in mainline evangelicalism, which is there is a coming judgment. There is a coming judgment in which God will, in the end, those who have rejected him, they will perish. Nobody wants to hear that. Everybody wants to hear, well, no, we all get to go, when we all get to heaven, we'll all be there. It's going to be one big happy party and everybody's going. And he says, no, the way of the wicked will perish.
They might believe in judgment, but they don't think about what he judges by.
Right. What will be the standard? The king has to have a standard. The standard by which he judges is the Torah. Did you obey me? Did you make an attempt to obey me? Even in an attempt, you got to move the right direction. But there was a heart towards being obedient. That's all he's asking for. Not asking for perfection, but he is asking for us to move in the right direction, which means we have to educate ourselves on what he says. My people perish for lack of knowledge. They're destroyed because they don't even know the text.